Hey, what's up? It's Dave from MomSimplyADad.com, and you're watching the Happy Healthy Family Podcast. We have Miss Leah Webb. Leah is the mom behind the website deeprootedwellness.com and the author of grain-free, dairy-free, and sugar-free Family Cookbook. That always throws me off because I always write it down GFDF-SF, and I write a lot about the GFCF diet, and then I put GFCF-SF, which is gluten-free, casein-free, soy-free, so then I always have to pause and think about it. But Leah, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dave. I am so excited about this opportunity to talk with you, and especially just having the opportunity to talk with another parent who deals with some issues with their kids. And while I know that we're dealing with very different things, I think that I've found personally a lot of community and just other parents that are dealing with these issues, especially parents like us who are really looking for alternative approaches to use complementary therapies in the treatment of our children's conditions.
Really liked your book. It kind of reminded me a little bit of the book that I used to, our family used to switch from standard American to paleo, which is practical paleo. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the books I had looked at when I went into writing my book. I looked at a lot of different books just to get ideas about things that I liked or didn't like, or even just to get some inspiration for different recipes. And I checked that one out from the library, and I specifically remember thinking, this is the type of book that I want to write, because I don't just want to supply people with recipes. I really want to teach people how and why to do this, because I've been a health coach for about 7 years, and I think that you can give anybody a recipe and that they can implement that recipe if they desire. But as far as making a huge dietary shift and implementing a major change like this, people really need the tool set to be able to do it. And that's what I did in my coaching practice. And so I really took that skill set and wrote the book to reflect that, of teaching people why this is important, how you can do it, and also trying to encourage people and offer kind of this positive psychology, a positive mindset about the diet. Because I think a lot of people, when they hear about restrictive diets, it's like, wah, wah.
Yeah.
And they're not very excited about it. And I think that restrictive diets, when done the right way, there's a lot of opportunity in eating a restrictive diet. And that's what I wanted people to see. I wanted it to be an encouraging resource that felt doable for people.
Yeah. And I will say the positive message definitely came out. There was several quotes you included in the book. I don't know if they were your quotes or if you were quoting someone else. I can't remember. But there was something, what was it? Like, not all storms come to... What is it? Oh, I'm going to mess it up now.
Yeah, that one is not mine, but it's not all storms come to, what is it? Not all storms come to do something, but some come to clear the path.
Yeah, I remember the clear the path. Oh, what was the other one? I wrote it, here it is. Not all storms come to disrupt your life. Some come to clear your path. That's what it was.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, I love that. Because, as an autism dad, that autism storm changed who I am, fundamentally, and it's made me a better person and opened my eyes to such a different world, and it's made me healthier even, and even with all the stress, it still made me a healthier, happier person. So I really connected with that message and your story too, because you're, unlike practical paleo, your story is included in your book, and it was a lot more personal. And I connected with a lot of those feelings of powerlessness and not knowing what to do next. I remember sort of the months and weeks almost year really surrounding my son's diagnosis, and doctors like, oh, there's nothing you can do, ABA, OT, that sort of thing. But so I really connected with that, how your daughter was diagnosed and your son had all these food allergies, and they're like, yeah, you're pretty much stuck like that. There's nothing you can do. But you also tell the story of how you took that power back and figured out ways to not only help your daughter with cystic fibrosis, but also, help your son sort of heal enough to get over a little bit of the food allergies, right?
Right.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and then start. I'd love for you to share a little bit of your story, and just tell everyone how you ended up, on this grain-free, dairy-free, sugar-free journey.
Okay, so it started about 7 years ago when my son was born, and at that time was when I was starting my health coaching practice. I was working some, but not a lot, and really wanted a job that had some flexibility in it. And so it turned out that the training that I was getting while I was pregnant with him was actually incredibly valuable in raising a son like this. So he was 4 months old when we found out that he had a dairy allergy. He had completely stopped gaining weight. And it turned out that he had blood in his stool, and he had a condition called occult intestinal blood loss, and it was from dairy. And so that was the dairy that I was eating, that he was getting through my breast milk. At that point, he wasn't eating solid foods. And when I stopped eating dairy, he started gaining weight again. And then when I started introducing foods to him, he just had a lot, he was always rashy. He always had eczema. And then when he started eating foods, it was like he always had these reactions. And so one of the first ones that we found was I gave him the tiniest little bite of bread, and he ended up vomiting for about 5 hours afterwards.
Oh, no.
And
how old was he at this point?
He was like 6 or 7 months old.
Oh,
and
no. That'd be terrifying.
It was terrifying, and I don't think I understood I didn't understand what was happening. So that a anaphylactic reaction, it can be a multi-organ response, and it can generally either be a respiratory response or a GI response. And so his anaphylactic response to wheat and barley was primarily a GI response. So what I was witnessing was my son, my 6-month-old son, being in anaphylaxis, and I just didn't know that. So when I told our pediatrician about this, she referred us to an allergist, and that's when we started to learn that not only was Owen allergic to wheat and barley and dairy, but it was also eggs, pistachios, cashews, oddly enough, seaweed. I don't understand what happened there, but it was verified by the allergist. And so, in some of these allergies, we found out by him having to be rushed to the ER because he would blow up like a balloon and get covered in hives. And so he was, I always felt like with Owen, we were teetering on the edge of disaster. It was like we're always watching over him like a hawk and trying to make sure that he wasn't eating the wrong things. And we always carried an EpiPen, and he just was really challenging. And it made it where my husband and I weren't really sure that we wanted to have a second child because we feared that we'd have another child with these same issues. But we did. And then my daughter does not have those same issues, but she was 2 weeks old when they did routine newborn screening, and she was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. And just for people who don't know, cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease that primarily impacts the lungs and pancreas. There's a protein, the CFTR protein, that regulates salt movements in and out of your cells. And this keeps your mucuses at a good consistency. But with people who have CF, those proteins don't work properly. And so you end up with abnormally thick and sticky mucuses throughout the body. And so in the lungs, the job of mucus is to actually move things out that shouldn't be in there. So things like dead cells, spent DNA, bacteria, your mucus will move those things out. But if you can imagine your mucus is really thick and sticky, that then becomes a wonderful breeding ground for bacteria.
Yeah.
And so for you and I, when we get illnesses, we can clear those using our own immune responses, but my daughter can't do that. So she frequently takes antibiotics. And that was kind of a hard part about learning to accept her disease, is that because we know all this information about the side effects of antibiotics, but they really are a necessary part of her treatment. So that's how, and then, as you can imagine, I have these two kids with these different issues, but I wanted to find some type of way that I could better support them. And I think a lot of the motivation, honestly, came out of desperation and this feeling of hopelessness and some of the things that you just described, of feeling like you're really out of control and that you've just been dealt this thing that what are you going to do with it? And so I just really wanted to find a solution. And I do have a background in research. I've worked in academia in varying settings as a researcher in different labs, and ended up just using that skill set to look at diet and how I might be able to support my kids. And one of the things that I learned that stood out as being the most important factor in supporting them is that about 85% of your immune response originates in your gut. And so if you think about allergies and asthma, the symptoms that we were seeing in my son, this is an out of control immune response. His immune response was faulty. And then you think about my daughter really needing to have this strong immunity so that she can fight these infections, but that she's also having to take all these antibiotics that are going to be constantly wiping out that beneficial bacteria population. I wanted to focus on gut health as a way to help my children. And that's when I focused on the GAPS diet, which is gut and psychology syndrome. I'm guessing you've heard of this diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've actually had a podcast episode on it with Kara from Health, Home, and Happiness. She's another parent, and she actually specializes a lot in GAPS diet. I think that was episode 4 for anybody who wants to go back and check that out. But you can go ahead and give us a little intro about what GAPS is.
The GAPS diet was developed by Natasha Campbell McBride, and she worked with kids specifically who have autism, spectrum disorder, schizophrenia, all of these different psychological issues. And what she saw is that these kids that had these psychological problems, that oftentimes they also had digestive distress and other issues. So she hypothesized that these issues were originating in the gut, and that if you could heal the gut, you could heal these other symptoms and issues that these kids were having. And so she developed the GAPS diet, which I won't go into the details of what that is just because it's kind of extensive.
Yeah.
But she developed that diet as a way to treat these problems in kids. But the reason that it stood out to me as being beneficial is because she was focusing on gut health. And so I used a lot of the principles of the GAPS diet in introducing solids to my daughter. The thing that we did that was different, we actually did 2 main things that were different. For one, GAPS, they do promote the use of raw fermented dairy. And because my son had problems with dairy in the past, and for him, it just felt like dairy did not make sense. It felt like it was an inflammatory food and that it was best that he needed to avoid that for a few years. And then also for my daughter, we avoided it because dairy is a mucus-producing food. Chinese medicine teaches you that different foods can be mucus-producing, and dairy is one of those foods. And so for my daughter, it made sense to avoid it, given the fact that she had cystic fibrosis. But other than that, we started following, these principles of the GAPS diet, which snowballed into this grain-free, dairy-free, sugar-free diet, and we stuck with it pretty strictly for about 3 years. And that's what I ended up writing this book about, is how to implement this diet in a way that doesn't also make you lose your mind.
Yeah. So before we go into that, are you guys still following that diet? Are you a little bit more lax now, or?
We are definitely a little bit more lax. And it's been for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that we experienced most of the benefits that we're going to get from this diet. My son has improved by leaps and bounds. So he used to have this whole list of allergies, and now he's down to just wheat and barley. And he is very allergic to those things. I mean, he's allergic to wheat like people are allergic to peanuts. And because of the severity of his allergy, I mean, we rarely eat out. We have 2 restaurants we go to, and we go there about twice a year. Just because it's not worth the risk. It doesn't feel very safe for him. And he also used to have all these sensitivities, things that cause rashes and digestive distress. And I don't see those same symptoms in him anymore. He also has asthma, and we have almost entirely eliminated his daily medications. Sometimes he can entirely go off of his meds, but then sometimes he has some issues and he has to go back on them. But what we've noticed most recently is a lot of those issues are related to environmental allergens, things like mold and cats and things that are just really hard for us to control. And so I think that we experienced a lot of benefits, and I am interested in eating more grains and dairy in moderation, not very often, but using the Weston A. Price Foundation, using their practices for eating these foods. So with grains, if we're going to eat them, A, I want them to be organic, and B, I want to process them in a way that's actually digestible. So doing things like soaking, sprouting, and fermenting, and then cooking those grains. But we're not doing a lot of that. And then when we do buy dairy, it's got to be grass fed or from animals that were pasture raised. And ideally I'd find raw, but I found that that's pretty challenging to find. So we do eat some pasture raised cheese sometimes, and every now and then we do eat some grains. And but yeah, for the most part, we stick with it, like 90%, like 80 to 90%, I'd say.
That's pretty good. Yeah, with the asthma thing, my wife had lifelong, like, terrible asthma where she needed an inhaler twice a day, just, for maintenance. And then on, the bad days when it was like really cold, she would need it more, or whenever what seasons would change, or whenever the environmental allergens were high, she would have to do it more often. But then she gave up dairy, and she's been fine ever since. She hasn't had an inhaler in over 5 years. So,
yeah,
I mean, it's crazy the impact of just giving up dairy. I mean, we've gone full on paleo since, but just giving up dairy just like takes away asthma. It's crazy amazing.
Yeah.
Like, to see her and know her before she gave up dairy, and now she's like, we don't even have an inhaler in the house anymore. It's like, it's crazy. I mean, she still has times where her chest gets tight, she eats something that might have been moldy or something like that. But, she just kind of chills out, and her body kind of deals with it without needing the steroid. So it's pretty awesome.
And that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of the benefits that we've seen for my husband as well. He is very similar. He's been on asthma medication since he was about 18 months of age. And after following this diet for a full year, he was able to stop taking his meds. And for him, the problem food is actually wheat. So he doesn't notice as much of a difference from dairy. But even if every now and then he'll drink a beer or something, and then he has asthma issues again. And so for him, it has been a really beneficial thing as well. And we weren't even necessarily doing this diet for him. I mean, you know how this goes. It's like you're so focused on your kids and you think kids, got to heal the kids. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, look at what happened to me. This is cool.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we were a little stubborn, I guess, in the beginning, because Ethan was on the diet, I don't know, 4 years. And we're just like, no, Ethan can't have that. Ethan can't have that. And we're just still, putting him to bed. And then we drive through McDonald's, or we order a pizza, while Ethan's in bed. All the kids are in bed. And meanwhile, we're getting sicker and sicker. And finally, I'm like, I'm learning all this stuff. Why in the hell am I not applying this to the rest of us? And then we did. And now, hey, oh my goodness, we're like, my wife and I combined lost over 100 pounds, and we made the switch to paleo. And like, we had our third kid, and she's getting ready to turn 5 next month, and she's yet to have a sick visit, much less need an antibiotic. So I'm pretty proud of that. But so let's go ahead and talk more about the book and sort of this diet/lifestyle. So is there like someone in particular that should try this sort of restricted diet, or do you think all families would be better off for adopting a similar diet?
So I think that's a great question. And I think that there are a number of people that would benefit from at least trying this diet. I think that food is complicated, and that everybody is a individual, and there's no one size fits all approach. And there are so many different diets out there that could potentially be beneficial in the treatment of whatever condition you're trying to treat. So I do realize that it is extremely difficult to sort through all of this information. I do, however, feel that the diet that my family prescribed to without grains, dairy, and sugar is an excellent starting point, because it's much less restrictive than some of these other options that are out there. But specifically, people who could benefit from this type of diet are people who are having some type of faulty immune response, whether that be eczema or some type of rashes, allergies, somebody who has chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation, that comes any of those diseases that end in itis. So arthritis or diverticulitis or even chronic infections like bronchitis, if you're getting frequent ear infections or your child is getting frequent infections, this is a sign of chronic inflammation. I think that these people it'd be worth them trying out this diet. And then people who have any type of digestive distress. So I think especially in kids, there's a lot of kids that are colicky, have reflux, constipation, diarrhea, chronic stomach pains. I think that this diet is a really good starting point for those people. And even though it's not in my book title, I also avoid soy for the most part. I think that there's maybe 1 or 2 recipes in there where I do use a gluten-free soy sauce, but that would be pretty easy to eliminate if you're trying to avoid soy. But I think that for people who are experiencing these problems, it's oftentimes that the most common foods are going to be gluten or grains, dairy, and soy. And that just seems like a really manageable starting point to me, rather than trying some of these other extreme diets like autoimmune paleo has been extremely helpful for some people. But then all of a sudden you're getting rid of nuts and eggs and nightshades, and then it just becomes a little bit more challenging. But I also think that one of the benefits that came out of following this diet for my family was that we started thinking outside the box when it came to meal planning and what foods were actually available to eat. And in that sense, I think it's worth people exploring a restrictive diet, in that we focus as Americans, we focus so much on wheat-based products. So pancakes and muffins and bagels for breakfast, and then you have sandwiches for lunch, and then you're eating crackers for snack and pasta for dinner. And then all of a sudden you've forgotten about all of these other things that are available. And when you eliminate those foods, what you find is that sweet potatoes taste pretty good. And there's like 12 different varieties of winter squash just at your local grocery store, more if you go to the farmer's market. And beets are pretty delicious, and you can do a lot of things with them. And so you start to find these other foods that you can eat to replace those carbohydrates that we're normally getting in the form of grains. And so even if you're not interested necessarily in going full out in this diet, I think that it is worth checking out, just because you'll see that there's all these opportunities to eat vegetables. And I found this to be a really nutrient dense way of eating. And I love food. I love to cook. I love to eat. I have a huge garden. I love to grow food. And for me, this has offered a lot of opportunities for creativity in the kitchen and just seeing what different types of things that I can do with foods.
Yeah, and if you guys want to check out her garden, she does all sorts of videos and stuff on Instagram and Facebook, so you could check her out, and she'll show you her gigantic garden and the ridiculous things she's cooked. You posted something last night. I was like, really? Your kids really eat that? I can't remember what it was. I mean, I shared it on mine. I stole your picture when I made my post. Well, what it was like? Oh my goodness. What did you have for dinner last night? I can't remember.
It was a vegetable saute with, it was zucchini, carrots, kale, some other vegetable too. I can't remember. Some steamed edamame, and then a carrot and cucumber salad. And here's the thing though. I think, yes, my kids do eat it, but sometimes they complain too. Like they're just like everybody else's kids. And my kids, I would not consider them to be picky eaters, but they do, especially during the summer, because I have so many fresh vegetables, and I feel like what is available is what is available. And I spend so much time working on that garden and growing this food, washing it, cooking it. I think I've even said these things to my children at times. Started to say, you are not grateful. And, and then they still complain about it sometimes. But, they do eat it, yes.
Yeah. I say, I'm kind of a recovering picky eater. And so, like, the reason I'm able to get my kids to eat more vegetables is because I still don't like them. So I have to make sure that I like them. And when I like them, they like them, you know.
Yep.
It's just a matter of changing the texture a little bit, or cooking them a little extra longer so they're mushy, or a little not as long so they're just still retaining their crunch depending on what it is.
Yep.
But yeah, so check out her on Instagram. I'll link it to that in the show notes too. But and yeah, so back to the diet. If you take a look at like pretty much any sort of holistic paleo or like autoimmune type book, like the Autoimmune Solution or the Walls Protocol or the Holistic RX, which I just interviewed Dr. Medea for the author of that book, they're all grain-free, dairy-free, sugar-free. And the GAPS is pretty much the same thing except for, you know, the 24-hour yogurt. But so yeah, I would agree that that's a good place to start. And it is, you know, I say that I'm a picky eater, but your taste buds do change because just yesterday I made a smoothie because I'm trying to eat more vegetables. I mean, I eat more than I did, but I still need to eat more. And so I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to start. Instead of having dinner, I'm just going to have like a protein shake with like spinach, and I'll just throw some frozen strawberries in it, you know. And I was convinced I was going to have to put some stevia in there.
Yeah.
And then so I'm like, let me taste it first. And I was like, that's pretty good. You could actually like taste the strawberry, you know.
I can stand this.
Exactly.
This isn't horrible.
And I'm like, you know, I knew, because when we first started, before we even went paleo or anything, the first thing we did was we started making homemade green smoothies. And we did spinach and pineapple, and then we'd add raw honey to it. And it was so delicious, but of course there was like so much sugar in it because pineapples are high in sugar, and so is honey. And so I'm like, I'm going to go back to that, and but I'm going to add some protein into it this time. But so when I tasted it, I thought for sure I'd be like, oh, this is gross. But then I'm like, ooh, strawberries. It's been a long time since I've had strawberries.
You're like, this is so great. My taste buds are changing. I can handle this. Just fruit.
Exactly. Just fruit, and it was spinach. And I somehow was able to choke down the spinach. But, you know, thanks to the strawberries. Now, I choked down a lot, I should say. You know, like you were talking about beets, and I stuck my tongue out at you.
Yeah.
But I do juice beets, and I actually like a beet ginger juice, you know, with cucumber and celery. I actually really enjoy that. Probably just because it makes me feel healthy, you know, like I'm drinking something that's really good for me. Not necessarily that I enjoy the taste, but I like the feeling it gives me. Like I'm doing something proper for my body, you know what I mean?
Right, like you're supplying it with the living nutrition that it needs. I mean, and that's how I feel when we're eating from my garden. Is the food just feels so much more alive to me.
Yeah.
And I think that when you're juicing things, that's the same type of benefit. And I'm sure there's some scientific reason that you feel that way, but that's how I know how to describe it. Is it just feels like you're eating something living and providing yourself with superior nutrition.
Maybe it's the structured water that's in the plants. I don't know. But so let's talk about some of the reasons why all these things are bad. Just to give us a little bit more, we like to go a little bit more in depth. And so when the neighbor or the random stranger says, "So why don't you eat gluten or why don't you eat grains?" What do you tell them? Aside from the fact that your son has allergies.
Yeah, right.
Because that's an easy one.
Right. Well, I would have to take him to the ER if we ate these things. So, no, usually, it depends on who I'm talking to as far as what response I give them, because you can usually tell that some people just kind of glaze over and think that you're speaking the woo-woo, depending on what response you give them. But I think that I do like to use scientifically backed information, just because I think the researcher in me likes to know what you're supposed to do, but I really like to understand why you're supposed to do it as well. And when we started going gluten-free, that was pretty immediate. We had no choice, and there were zero exceptions that could be made on that front due to the severity of his allergy. And what I found is that a lot of these gluten-free products, they're recreated using these starches and fillers and different processed ingredients that are trying to create wheat-like products without the wheat. And to me, what that felt like is a total waste of money and time, because here we had these health issues and we had a real medical reason to avoid gluten, yet we were replacing the offending food with these processed ingredients. And so that's when I really started cooking a lot more. I mean, I've always enjoyed cooking, but I think at that point I really stepped it up a little bit just in order to ensure that we were eating something quality. And then once my daughter was born and I started reading more about grains, because we used to eat things like buckwheat, I would grind my own grains in my Vitamix blender and make my own flours. And so I was still making healthy foods. But then looking at some of the constituents that are in grains and how those affect your digestion. And so the two that I focus on in my book, and you can really read other books to get a lot more information about this. I mean, David Perlmutter in Grain Brain, his book, I mean, you can read an entire book about why grains are problematic. But the two that I focus on my book are phytic acid and lectins. And phytic acid is considered an anti-nutrient. And what that means is that it competes for the absorption of minerals because it binds to those minerals and then makes them unavailable for uptake and assimilation into the body. And so even though some of these grain-based foods do have health benefits, they have vitamins and minerals, some of those benefits are negated because of things like phytic acid. So lectins are a carbohydrate binding protein, and not all lectins are bad. Lectins actually they can embed themselves within cell membranes and help to communicate between cells, but some of the lectins that are found in grains can be detrimental to the lining of the gut. And so what happens when you eat lectins is that they can degrade the tight junctions between the cells in your small intestines. And what happens when those cells are degraded is that you end up with a faulty filtration system. Your digestion, the way it works is things move through, it starts in your mouth, moves to your stomach. I mean, there's certain digestion that's happening at every single point. And in your small intestines is where you have your digestive enzymes and the villi and all of your body's own mechanisms to digest your food. And when those particles become small enough to be absorbed, they are then absorbed into your blood or your lymph. And that filtration system is what tells it whether or not, yes, this is usable food, this is usable nutrition, or no, this should keep continuing down the digestive tract until it can be further degraded so that it is in a usable form. So when I say that the tight junctions are being compromised by lectins, what happens is you start to have food particles that seep into your bloodstream and into your lymph that are not supposed to be there. And this is where you get a condition called leaky gut. And then your body sees these particles as foreign invaders, and then it charges on the immune response. And so in normal circumstances, you want an immune response. This helps to protect your body. But when you constantly have these antigens that are moving into your blood and your lymph, you end up with chronic inflammation. And when you have chronic inflammation, that's when you can start to have these diseases. And the other thing with lectins is that they don't just degrade those tight junctions, they actually act as transporters across the membrane. So they can bind with other compounds that are in undigested food that's not fully digested. Lectins can bind with those compounds and transport them across those across those tight junctions to where you're getting even more offending foods into your blood and lymph. So that's how we kind of ended up. That's how we ended up avoiding grains entirely, is just learning about this information on these compounds that are present and why they should be avoided. Now, I do think it's also important to note that if you look at the teachings of Weston A. Price Foundation, what they will say is that when you soak, sprout, and ferment your grains, a lot of these compounds are degraded, and so you're actually able to get more health benefits from the food that you're eating. And when I learned that, I think for me, that felt like a lot of work. Yeah. And it's a lot easier just to dice up a sweet potato and shove it in the oven than it is to preemptively think days in advance about this oatmeal that you want to make and how you need to have your whey for fermentation and your soaking and your sprouting and these 8 million steps that go along with it. And I think that's probably some of the reason that I have felt now that I can eat a few grains is that my kids are a little bit older and I'm not in that period of time where it's so time intensive and so dense. I mean, when your kids are little, I feel like you're just so absorbed in their care that there's very little time for anything extra. And now my daughter is 4 and my son is almost 7. And so I do feel like I have a little bit more time to experiment with some of these things, but it's very time intensive to prepare grains in the correct way.
Yeah, for sure. And if you guys want more on how to sort of on why and how to prepare foods more traditionally, like Weston A. Price, I did interview Wardy Harmon. Goodness, I think it was episode 8. It was one of the first batch I did last summer, I think. So I'll put that in the show notes if you guys want to check that out too, or you can just scroll back on the phone. Then you'll find. I think the episode's called "Why We Should Cook Like Grandma" or something like that. I can't remember.
Oh, that's a good title.
but you'll see Wardy. So basically the grains, they're hard on the gut. That's what I always say mostly to family, why don't you eat grains? Well, because they're hard on the gut and they kind of spike your blood sugars. And then also, depending on who asks,
right.
then you have to think about the glyphosate and the pesticide, that especially on gluten, but some of the other grains too. Wheat is not a GMO, but unfortunately they now, through crop desiccation, they spray our wheat right before they harvest it just to dry it out and kill it basically, and it makes it a heck of a lot easier for the farmer to harvest, I think is the word.
Right, and they end up with a higher yield. And I also think people don't realize this, but they also do that with legumes and canola. So yes, we do focus a lot. You hear more attention in the media on grains, but it's also happening with legumes. And I think that's important for people to note, especially who are on a vegetarian diet, because if they're eating all of these beans and grains as sources of proteins and carbs, chances are that they're probably getting higher exposure to glyphosate than people who are eating a meat-based diet.
Interesting. I didn't realize that about the legumes. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about some of the reasons why we shouldn't do dairy. Some of those reasons are kind of similar to grains, as they're a very similar structure to gluten, or casein, the protein, is a similar structure to gluten. So it can activate the autoimmune type functions in molecular mimicry and that sort of thing. But so here's the number one question I always get when people ask me about the gluten-free, casein-free diet, and I'm sure people will ask you too, what about calcium?
Oh, yeah, I love that question. So we are so focused on calcium, and there's a really great book written by Anne-Marie Colbin called The Whole Foods Guide to Strong Bones. And Anne-Marie, she passed away, I think last year or the year before, but she has been preaching about bone health and using whole foods as a way to have healthy bones as you age. She's been preaching about since like the 70s, and people are just starting to listen to what she says. So we are so focused on calcium, but what she talks about is how and I do have a section in my book where I talk about bone health and calcium, because this, of course, is the question that you get.
Yeah.
And what she talks about is how there are all of these different minerals and proteins and vitamins that actually go into having strong bones, and it's not just about the calcium. And your bones are made of a collagen matrix, which is a protein matrix, which actually gives your bones some flexibility. So if you were to fall or bang your shin really hard, or whatever it is that you do to your bones, if they're so brittle, if they're just rock hard structures, chances are they're going to break. And so this collagen matrix that comes from eating proteins will give your bones that they're able to absorb impact better rather than just break. So the other component in your bones is going to be this mineral component. So things like calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, all of these different minerals. And this is what makes your bones rigid. So if you were to take away this collagen matrix, the protein matrix that's in your bones, and just leave behind the mineral component, what you end up with is a structure that's a lot like chalk. So it's very breakable.
Yeah.
And when you dissolve away the mineral component and you're left with just the protein collagen matrix, you have something that's bendable and doesn't break. So her argument is that we have put so much focus on the calcium all we're doing is building this mineral component of our bones and actually making them more breakable. So the United States has one of the highest rates of hip fractures, osteoporosis, and bone diseases in the world. And the only countries that have higher rates than us are countries that are eating more milk per capita than us. And so I think that what you can see, there's a trend towards more milk equals more bone disease. And so first off, I don't believe that we need as much calcium as we think. And we eat a lot of cruciferous vegetables, things like kale, collards, Brussels sprouts, all of those types of vegetables. Cauliflower is a new craze. Apparently you can make anything out of it. Yep. And you get a lot of calcium from eating these vegetables. And some other really great sources of foods to help protect your bones are going to be things like eating bones. So sardines, making bone broth, those types of foods have a better nutrient profile to support your bones than just eating dairy, where you're really just focusing on the calcium.
Yeah, we should specify the sardines are the sardines with bones, not the boneless sardines.
Yeah, exactly.
I buy boneless sardines, and I hate sardines, but my kids actually like them. 2 of my kids like them, which is the most bizarre thing on earth. But and my wife likes them, but they won't eat the bones. But I'll take the nice omegas and the protein, and we'll just we'll figure out our minerals somewhere else.
You're like, I'll just have my bone broth for days.
Exactly. Well, the protein that I put in my smoothie I was telling you about is actually the bone broth or the collagen protein. So there you go.
There you go. Avoid those. Well, and I buy the headless, tailless, scaleless versions, but I like them, and my kids actually really like them too. My kids do disgusting things to them. I won't tell you, but
with the bones, they'll eat them with the bones.
They pull the bones out and then eat the bones by themselves. I mean,
no way.
It's disgusting. Well, my husband won't eat them. And
yeah, that's me.
So when he watches, he can't even watch them eat them, but he just finds it to be totally repulsive.
I think I'm in his camp, so it's all right.
Yeah.
Oh, man. There's so much I wanted to talk to you about, and we're already running low on time. But let's hit sugar real fast, and then we'll go over a little bit of the book, and then we'll have to get you back on because there's a lot of stuff I want to talk to you about. So
okay.
But anyway, so speaking of weak bones and things that can weaken our bones, a high sugar diet can, increase the pH of our blood, I guess, and strip in an effort to, bring homeostasis and rebalance, our bones release minerals, and then we end up with weak bones. But you actually go pretty deep into some of the deleterious effects of sugar in your book. And you talk about something called glycation in ages. What is that? Advanced glycation in products. So can you tell us what that is? Because it's pretty important, and not a lot of people are talking about that.
Yeah, and that is the number one thing that I like to talk to people about sugar, because I think that for years we've talked about sugar being a calorie, it's void of nutrients. So it's nutritionally void food. But I think that the bigger problem is that sugar actually has measurable toxic effects on the body. And it's things that people don't quite understand yet. And so glycation, sugar can bind with other things like fats and proteins. And when sugar binds with these proteins, it does a couple of things. First off, it renders those proteins useless. Their function is lost. And so if you think about a disease like my daughter's cystic fibrosis, she has a faulty protein, and that's the whole basis of her disease. And so when you render these proteins useless and you've lost their function, you have some type of cascading effect. Proteins are going to be your building blocks. They're your mechanism of communication between cells. I mean, they're what keep the body moving, running, and growing and communicating. And so when you lose those proteins, that is gone. The other problem is that these ages, when the when the sugar binds with the proteins and the fats, you end up with advanced glycation end products, AGEs, as they're called. And these AGEs become sources of free radical production. And these free radicals are what cause oxidative stress in your body. So oxygen is the ultimate electron acceptor in metabolism of cells. And this is true for animals, plants. I mean, we need oxygen for life. And that's why, because it's involved in metabolism. It's involved in these metabolic pathways. And what you can end up with is a strange number of electrons on that oxygen molecule, which gives it a strange charge. It gives it a reactive charge. And that reactive charge can bounce around through your DNA and your cells and create oxidative stress. And that's the whole reason that we eat antioxidants, because these reactive oxygen species can cause oxidative stress. And so you have to combat those reactive oxygen species with antioxidants. I know this is...
That was a mouthful there.
It was a mouthful. I hope everyone understood that. So what they have seen is they've looked at a variety of diseases, and they see that there is an element of glycation and inflammation that is related to things like Alzheimer's and liver disease and things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be related to sugar specifically. So I think when people think about sugar, they're usually thinking about metabolic disease and diabetes. But these are diseases that aren't necessarily associated with that. And they can measure that sugar does cause the development of AGEs. And then they've also measured that AGEs cause these diseases, but they haven't necessarily made that direct connection between sugar and disease, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, that's probably the next step. I mean, that's where I would like to see the research go, is to see how it is that sugar causes glycation and how glycation ends up causing disease. But I think that's a big part of sugar that people aren't quite paying attention to, is how it actually can result in these other diseases.
And that makes sense. You know, we often hear that, you know, sugar is inflammatory. And so that's just one of the mechanisms there that can be inflammatory. That, and of course, it spikes your blood glucose, which means, you know, it starts a whole other cascade of events. But goodness, we could go on and on. We could have a whole podcast on sugar. I probably should, actually.
You probably should. I mean, and sugar is always so interesting to me, too, because I've tried to do some work in my son's school on changing policies and things like that, and just really trying to persuade. Yeah, tell me about it. So, you know, but I've even tried to find different studies to support my argument. And it's really interesting that there are very few to no studies showing that sugar has impacts on behavior. And I know, it's shocking. So I've even found studies that show that if you give kids sugar before they take a test, that they have improved test scores as a result. And so I've really found this whole lack of compelling evidence to talk people into this stuff beyond this glycation argument, because I think that this, for a lot of people don't understand disease. They don't understand what it's going to actually be like to have a disease and what it's actually going to be like for that to be your life. And they don't understand it until they're in it. And so when you preach prevention, 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 a lot of the time they just don't hear you. And so that's why I'm looking for this behavioral information, like, hey, if you stop feeding your kids sugar, they'll get better test scores. And the evidence just isn't there.
Yeah. Oh, man. I mean,
oh, bummer, huh?
I mean, the test thing, I'm like, first thing I think of is like, well, who funded that study?
Yeah, right.
I'm like, go into any teacher's classroom right after lunch at any age and tell me that sugar doesn't do anything, and walk around the lunchroom and see what these kids are eating. Like, I spent, you know, a year as a teacher, and I had lunch duty occasionally, and I'm like, kids are eating like full, like, king size bags of M&Ms like for lunch, and I'm like,
yeah,
and I'll be like, what are you doing? That's not food. And of course, you know, the stuff that they're giving in the cafeteria isn't food either, but no, it's not a bag of M&Ms.
Right.
And then I'm like, every time, no matter like what group it was, like the class after lunch was like the worst. It was like the hardest, to get anything done. So the whole higher test score thing, like what world is that?
Yeah, I know. It's hard. It's amazing. I mean, it's the evidence is it's very skewed.
Yeah. It kind of makes it, when you were talking about working in the schools and how it's an uphill battle. It reminded me of sort of the things that one of the ideas, I guess you would say, in your book, that you were talking about how choosing to feed your kids a nourishing meal is the loving choice. We often we want to see them happier, or grandma wants to see them smile, so she brings them over, a candy bar or whatever it is. And it's that short term, oh, grandma gave me this. And so, we want to see our kids happy and get that immediate gratification. And we often end up sabotaging what we really want, which is to raise a happy, healthy, grown up, basically. And so we have to remember that when our kids are wanting the, dinosaur shaped chicken nuggets, or wanting to go through McDonald's, because their friends are going to McDonald's, or, whatever. It's that, by being, quote, mean and not letting them have that, it's an act of love. That was one of the things that I really loved about your book. What did you think? You said love your child with food or something like that. That was the title of the section.
Yeah, and that principle actually came from a detox program that I used to run with adults.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, I used to run a 10-day cleanse. And when people would sign up for it, they'd all be like, all right, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to eliminate the problem foods for 10 days. And then they were always really pleasantly surprised because I kind of flipped the viewpoint for them and said, you know what, you're doing this because you care about yourself, and you care about yourself enough to make some loving, nourishing choices. And that health is one of the absolute best assets and most important things that we have in life. And when you don't have your health, you have nothing. And a lot of people are walking through life not realizing that they're living in this kind of subpar bubble. They don't feel their best. And when you feel your best, you start to realize how many possibilities are out there. Like you're saying, you and your wife, it took you a long time to jump on this bandwagon, and then you jumped on it and you're like, man, we feel good. Like this doesn't just suck. And so I think that I've used that same concept with my kids, is that, when I do feed them these foods, even though they may complain, this is the loving choice that I'm making for them. And and that's not to say I don't let them have some of these other things too, because I think especially with children, they have a very hard time understanding what healthy is and why it even makes sense to eat healthy. And so I think for kids, it's really just about exposing them to all of these different foods, and then setting the example as a parent as, well, this is how you eat and this is how you take care of yourself. And so I do make some exceptions with them. I mean, as they've gotten older, I've had to make more exceptions. My son started kindergarten this year, and all of a sudden he's like, wow, look at what people eat. Yeah. And, and I don't want him to feel totally deprived, because that is a lot of his life, is feeling deprived, just because he absolutely cannot eat these foods ever. And so it's about striking a balance.
Yeah, balance is pretty much the key in everywhere.
Yeah,
and we're at the point, my son, we've always just brought food and told the teacher, just, let us know when there's a party or something, and we'll provide an extra treat for him. But now he's going into 6th grade, and he's going to have to start making his own choices now. We're going to have to start loosening the reins, and hoping that we've taught him enough.
Yeah. And then he doesn't swing in the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, he's good, and I think we're pointing things out. Like, he still follows the gluten-free, dairy-free stuff. And he'll occasionally have cheese when he goes out to eat and gets a gluten-free hamburger or cheeseburger or something like that. But we point things out. Like, you see how you feel really tired right now, and last night you went out and you had French fries and a big burger and whatever else you had after that. You see how you feel right now? You see how you're grumpy?
Yeah. Do you see how that may not have been a loving choice?
Right. But, so just kind of pointing that out, because adults aren't even as in tune with their body, so like teaching a kid is even harder, but just to be like, hey, you see how you feel right now? You make those connections. And even if he revolts for a little while, in high school or whatever, but that little voice is always going to be in his head, and it's going to be Dad saying, "What are you doing, dude?"
Yeah, right. How do you feel? Why do you think you feel like that?
Okay, so let's get a nice little plug in here for your book. What do you want people to know about the grain-free, dairy-free, sugar-free Family Cookbook?
What I want people to know is that this book is not about perfection, because I think that diet is complicated, and I think that there are a lot of pieces, there are a lot of components that play into having a healthy life and a healthy lifestyle. And one of the reasons that this book worked out was because what I found was that I was really pouring myself into my kids' food, and then I wasn't sleeping enough, I wasn't exercising enough, I wasn't taking care of myself enough because I was spending so much time focusing on the food. And I developed a meal planning and prep process that made my time in the kitchen much reduced. And so that's the system that I talk about in this book. And that's the reason that I wrote it, is because I do believe that health should encompass all of these other things. And I think that it is about balance and about integrating all of these different pieces. And if you're just so focused on the food, you are going to miss out on these other things. In the same breath, the food is really important, and it can either nourish you and heal you and supply you with the things that you need for your body to work optimally, or it can supply you with things that are going to do the exact opposite. And so I believe so strongly that food is worth putting in a seriously good effort, but I also think it needs to be done in a way that feels manageable so that you're not just driving yourself crazy. And that's what this book is about. It's for people who want to do better and who want to learn some more recipes and want to eat more vegetables. I mean, there's lots of vegetables in this book, but also feel like they want to do it in a way that is manageable over the long term.
And so I'm going to ask you to come back on and talk about your meal planning structure. There's actually a lot of stuff I want to talk to you about, such as picky eating and things like that, and just how to help people make the transition into a restricted diet should they want to try. But in the meantime, we're going to finish up here with my last question that I ask everyone, and that would be 3 practical things any parent can do to improve the health and happiness of their family.
Okay, and you did give me this question ahead of time, and really, I only have 2 things.
Oh.
So the first one is to put your oxygen mask on first. And I know that sounds so cliche, but I feel like I kind of ran myself ragged those first 18 months after my daughter was born, because I was so desperate and so heartbroken, and all of the things that come along with having a child that has problems. And I reached a pretty serious breaking point where my son had his most major anaphylactic reaction. I thought he was going to die. My daughter got C. diff. She ended up getting admitted to the hospital. Oh, wow. I mean, it was like back to back to back to back of a couple of months. And I was not in a very good spot. I was too depleted to cope with the problems that we had at that time. And especially when you're dealing with kids that you don't know when their next issue is going to come up, you've got to have your reserves full in order to deal with it. And that's been a big learning curve for me. I think that when your kids are really little, it's harder to put yourself first and to take care of yourself because they do require so much. But I think once you get out of that period and you do have the opportunity to do more things for yourself, I think that that is probably the healthiest way that you can approach being a parent in general, whether you have kids with issues or not. And then the second thing would be to always try to find the light that comes from the darkness. And I usually cry when I talk about this because I think that there is just so much heartache that does come along with, having these children that you just love them so much and you hate that they have these problems. You want nothing more than their life to be normal and to have the option to eat all the junk food like the other kids. And And so I think that if you can drown in that darkness, you can get covered up by it and then you can't get out of it. And then you're not teaching them how to get out of it either. And so I think that there have been a lot of gifts that have come from my children being in these situations. And sometimes you have to force yourself to see them. And, I'm not saying that you need to be happy all the time, because sometimes things suck. And it's okay to say, this sucks today. Things are not working out for us today. But I think that you have to move through that and then get to the other side and say, all right, well, yesterday things were hard, but today I am a healthier, happier person because I really know the value of health and life and things that, I've got wisdom, and you do too, that other people don't have. And so I think that would be my, so not food related, but that's my 2 cents to have happy, healthy family.
I think I'm going to allow you to only have 2 because those 2 were really, really good.
Well,
and really, really powerful. So I won't hold you to that 3rd one, even though I should. But
okay.
Well, so again, the book is called, let me give you the full title. Let me pull it up here. The Grain-Free, Dairy-Free, Sugar-Free Family Cookbook. Simple and delicious recipes for cooking with whole foods on a restricted diet. That's a mouthful.
I know. Tell me about it.
It seems like something one of as a blogger you would do to try and hit as many keywords as possible for Google to come up on search.
So this actually, my publishing company chose the title, and they choose the title based on what is searchable.
On keyword research, there you go. So,
yep, you nailed it.
A little inside blogging there. So, all right. So again, she's at Deep Rooted Wellness, and we told you the name of the book, all of which will be, in the show notes. Leah, thank you so much for joining me. It was a lot of fun, and I hope to get you back on very, very soon.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I'd love to come back.
All right, awesome. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.